down an open lane. People passing by, wearing hats with famous names written on the side. Their sideways glances say that there's something very wrong with us. Their fancy's very fanciful. They're different but the same. There's something vaguely comical, such pride devoid of shame. They strut the day fantastic, and everyone is driven by their lust. What's in at the fashion show? There's only one way to know. Come on, let's go. Let's go to Vanity Fair, where the jacks and the queens and the jokers run.
We are going to be talking about magazines today. I'm really excited about this show. I've been sort of screaming all morning, getting ready for it, because I've been reading Empire of the Elite, Inside Condé Nast, the media dynasty that reshaped America by Michael M. Grynbaum, who's with us right now. So, Michael, I'm going to do something I just sent a message to the producer, Lily Tyson, saying my big job for the next 2 segments is to get myself to shut up, because I had like so many sort of aha moments reading this often very hilarious and very interesting book. So I just want to say that it's kind of like we're looking at a big, huge production of Aida, and way over to the side of the stage holding a spear is like this guy who maybe only sings a couple of choruses. That's me in this story. I do want to say that I've worked for a lot of magazines, and in the late, this will get us into your story, in the late 1980s, Cy Newhouse fired Grace Mirabella as the editor of Vogue, put in Anna Wintour, a name we'll be saying a lot, and Grace Mirabella, who'd been their longtime editor and very lovely woman, was offered a lot of money, a very deep pockets opportunity by Rupert Murdoch to start a magazine called Mirabella. I attracted the attention of Vogue from a book that they had featured, and so I became a contributing editor at Mirabella for the first 2 years. And it was just so interesting. Maybe we'll circle back to this, but I really kind of got to look at the world that you're writing about here, this world of magazines, late 80s and through the 90s, this kind of highly competitive environment, this and very, very closely interlinked ecosystem, but with Newhouse and with Condé Nast at the very top of the pyramid. So, first of all, Michael, welcome, and let's talk a little bit more about this. And maybe it's a good place to start. My experience of this was on the Grace Mirabella end, but in a way, a lot of the story that we're going to tell today does start with the move towards Anna Wintour. So say a little bit about how you perceive that.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me on, and I'm honored to have a real-life contributing editor at Mirabella as my interlocutor today.
That and $4 will get you coffee at Starbucks, but sure.
Well, Anna Wintour, of course, has been in the news lately because after, I guess 40, almost 45 years, she has relinquished her title as editor-in-chief of American Vogue, although she is still sticking around the company, still now the global editorial director is her newfangled title. But it was, first of all, I was very pleased by this because she had the generosity to make that announcement 2 weeks before my book was published, which was, I really appreciated that. She didn't speak with me for the book, but I've decided to interpret that as her tacit validation. So, but yeah, this is a fascinating world, and you're right to zero in on the 80s and 90s, kind of this peak era of glossy magazines where they really were in charge of the zeitgeist in a lot of ways. I mean, they were the arbiters and the gatekeepers of fashion, movies, and style and taste. And Anna Wintour, who is this British import who comes from a London newspaper family, but really had sort of struggled in the early part of her career to make a name for herself, she enters the Condé pantheon in 1983. And by 1988, she has toppled Grace Mirabella and taken charge of Vogue magazine, and has really goes on to transform it into the global behemoth that it is today.
Yeah, there's one scene where I think she's talking to Grace, and Grace asks her what kind of job she would ever be interested in, and she says, "Yours," which I loved. And yeah, it's sort of funny too, because here in the kind of the tech era that followed the era that we're talking about now, phrases like words like disruption and the phrases like move fast and break things became very much watchwords for what was going on in this kind of tech-driven revolution that we're still living through now. But that was very much the vibe of the period let's talk about, we can talk about Wintour, we can also talk about Tina Brown. These are people who, they were disruptive, and they did move fast, and they did break things, and they made decisions that were often based on violating some of the canons and norms of the industry they were working in. Maybe this swerve over to Tina Brown just for a second and talk about a few of those things, starting with the Vanity Fair time. Maybe talk about the Reagan stomp. This is a really good example, I think, of Vanity Fair doing something that really didn't have an obvious precedent in the way it was depicting a presidency.
Yeah, so the Reagan Stomp is a famous cover of Vanity Fair that Tina Brown, who took over the magazine in 1984, she actually saved her career with that cover, because her Vanity Fair, which was a revival, of course, of this Jazz Age magazine back in the 20s and 30s that was really innovative at the time and published Picasso and Jack London and Proust and all these incredible writers, and had been defunct for many, many years. And Tina Brown kind of brought it back. And what I talk about in the book is that she created this high-low mix that at the time was quite revolutionary. Magazines really focused on a very narrow slice of what they thought their readers wanted to read. What Tina Brown did was say, okay, I can have a sexy celebrity profile right next to a serious policy assessment of what's going on in politics right now, or a look at the 1984 campaign. And in a funny way, this was a photo shoot where they went down to the White House and convinced Ronald and Nancy Reagan to come do a quick photo shoot with them. And they started dancing to a song. And it was this very personal, intimate photo of the two of them actually kissing. And this was kind of a merger of politics and an entertainment.
And Michael, wasn't there like someplace they were supposed to go, like some important person they were supposed to go see, and they kept getting stalled to do this kind of frivolous thing?
There was a state dinner, I think, for the ambassador from Argentina, the president of Argentina, and actually the way that Tina tricked Ronald into sticking around was she had brought a boombox into the White House. I guess the security measures were a little more lax back then, and started playing Frank Sinatra's "Nancy with the Laughing Face," which was one of Nancy Reagan's favorite songs. And she said to the president, "I love this song, honey, let's dance." And so she paused, she got him to hold off going to the state dinner. And they kind of did this nice, foxtrot. This was like in the East Wing somewhere. And Harry Benson, who was a British photographer, you've probably seen his photograph of the Beatles dancing on a hotel bed in the 1960s. Shoots this photograph of the two Reagans. Their eyes are shut, their lips are next to each other. And it's like this new way of seeing the president and the first lady. And it really kind of captured this very 1980s entwinement of celebrity and power and glamour that came to be what Vanity Fair represented at that time.
Yeah, and you have to read Michael's book. There's some gymnastics that had to be gone through just even to get those photos in and override some qualms that the White House might have had about them, and maybe even the Cy Newhouse might have had about them. But and so many of the stories, the great stories in this book, but they're often about just sort of threading certain kinds of needles. And let's just stay with Tina Brown for a second and kind of look at that sort of whole arc of disruption. So, she does what she does at Vanity Fair, and then she goes over to the New Yorker. And the New Yorker had, I think, between 1928 and her arrival, until the Gottlieb experiment, which was like in 78 or something like that. But 1928 to 1978, they had two editors. They had Harold Ross and William Shawn for really, really a long time. And the magazine didn't change very much, and its audience, I think, its readership thought of itself as, wanting it not to change very much, because why do you read in the New Yorker in the first place? And Brown came in with kind of the same thing. I mean, photos, photos was like this incredibly disruptive, weird idea, Michael.
Yeah, and okay, when we talk about disruption, I think one thing that's worth just framing this discussion is to sort of bring ourselves back in the time machine to this pre-internet era. Because when I set out to write a book about kind of the peak moment of magazines, what I realized was that, magazines had a monopoly on culture. I mean, there was no internet. So if you wanted to find out about who the latest movie stars were, or you wanted to, dig into any trends or what was going on at fashion shows in Europe, you were dependent to wait once a month for your issue of a Condé Nast magazine to plop through your mail slot. And it really kind of created this sense of community, right? So the New Yorker, we're talking about its long history, the New Yorker was really a touchstone for a certain leisure class of, upper middle brow Americans. You might remember your parents having it on the coffee table. It was sort of this, shortcut signifier to say, I'm kind of a literate intellectual person and I read the New Yorker. And when Tina Brown took it over in 1992, first of all, her getting the job, there were two front page stories in the New York Times that day. And I just like sitting and thinking about the idea of a magazine getting a new editor in chief meriting two front page stories in the Times. And she came in and said, listen, this formula had gotten a little stale. We need to make the New Yorker more relevant to the news cycle. We need to make it, we need to bring in color photographs. They had never had photographs in the magazine. There was a time when the New Yorker refused to have a table of contents because they decided that, there's a famous story about a New Yorker copy editor in the 80s who sort of went one day to his boss and said, maybe we should at the beginning of the magazine, just for the reader's convenience, say, well, here's the articles that they're going to expect in this week's issue. And their boss just paused and looked at them and said, it's none of the reader's business what's in the magazine. So these changes, even having full page ads, I mean, the New Yorker, they hadn't solicited subscribers in 20 years. So Tina said, first of all, let's make money so that we can, keep this place running, keep the lights on. And then let's start writing about what's in the news. Let's write about, say, the O.J. Simpson murder trial, which I think until then, by the way, when the New Yorker started covering that, there were all these New Yorker staff writers who literally quit in protest because this seemed too vulgar. This seemed too lowbrow for the esteemed New Yorker to be concerning itself with. And Tina Brown said, the New Yorker has to stay relevant to a new generation, and we need to write about sex. We need to write about true crime. We need to write about celebrities who are in the news. We can do that with a New Yorker style, with kind of an intellectualized, smart take. But, this magazine has to be relevant if it's going to survive. And that was a real controversy at the time.
As you point out, too, that decision to cover the O.J. case essentially launched the career of, at that point, a fairly obscure person named Jeffrey Toobin, who right away figured out, how to do this kind of thing and how to bring a story to Robert Shapiro that Robert Shapiro didn't necessarily know about. It was just terrific stuff. But, I think also it's almost impossible to overstate the degree to which, if you were a certain kind of person, I was writing a bit in magazines. My main job was a columnist in the Hartford Courant. I also wrote for Northeast Magazine there, which was, I think, a really, really good newspaper magazine. If you were kind of anywhere in that world even, or just a really avid reader, the degree to which what did Tina Brown do today was a thing that people talked about. And the example I'm going to pick is probably the most lurid one, but it's also just so great. When she published the Daphne Merkin essay, I'm going to let you take over and tell this story.
Well, so Tina decided that she wanted to do a women's issue of the New Yorker. And she made it known that there was a loudmouthed comedian that she was taken with by the name of Roseanne Barr, who at the time had, one of the most popular sitcoms in America. And Tina said, well, wouldn't it be fun if Roseanne was the guest editor for this issue of The New Yorker? Now, it is hard to overstate the reaction to this. I mean, truly, New Yorker staff writers went public saying that this was, a shonda, that this was the absolute betrayal of all the values that the New Yorker stood for. I actually went back, I went on eBay and I bought the women's issue that appeared in 1995. And excuse me, 1996. And it is an incredible, I mean, there is such erudite, brilliant writing in there. But the article that got the most attention was a piece by Daphne Merkin, who was a cultural critic and writer. And she wrote an article called Unlikely Obsession about her kind of dalliance with S&M. And she wrote about how she kind of likes spanking in her sex life. And I mean, to tell you the truth, it's the sort of thing that you see everywhere on the internet right now, kind of the first person confessional about one's romantic or sex life. I mean, this is now a part of, every magazine and including, the New York Times magazine. You read stories like this all the time now. So Merkin's article comes out and people were absolutely scandalized. There were op-eds in papers across the country about the prurence of this article appearing in the New Yorker. And I spoke to Merkin about this, and she said, women were coming up to her on the playground saying they were shocked that she would admit all of this in a national magazine. And, the truth is, one thing she said to me was, no one said Norman Mailer's essays were confessional, or there wasn't a backlash against men when they wrote about their dating lives, and this was sort of this sexist double standard. But there were New Yorker writers who basically quit over this issue. It was really pretty shocking.
Yeah, and really, behind all that, I'm shocked. Were a lot of people who read every single freaking word of that piece. And then, everybody liked talking about it too. I mean, I was part of a lot of conversations and they weren't, oh, isn't this horrible? It was just like, wow, this is really interesting. I've never seen anything like that, and certainly not anything like that in the New Yorker of all places, as you're suggesting. It was sort of that kind of. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, this is also the argument that I make in the book, and Tina Brown's New Yorker was the first New Yorker that I encountered when I was a teenager, like starting to read magazines. My mother had been a lifelong subscriber to the New Yorker, so it was always sitting around our house. But what I think Tina was doing was, until the 80s, there was this kind of hierarchy of taste in America. So if you were sort of upper class or aspired to be part of kind of an upper echelon of, you were sort of supposed to appreciate opera and classical music and kind of these high arts. And I think what Tina was doing was saying, look, like all sorts of topics are worthy of intellectual pursuit. We can think seriously about S&M or, the OJ trial. And, there's a way to do this that is, intellectually stimulating. And I think that what she was doing is kind of widening the aperture of what a certain class of Americans felt they could consume culturally. And I think that today's world of true crime podcasts and Serial on NPR, a lot of that you can look back and say that Tina was the person who said, hey, it's okay for sort of an educated audience to be interested in all kinds of topics.
So I want to just cover one more thing before we go to a break. And I'm going to tell a quick story because it sets up a really good story of yours too. But one thing that's really, that comes out in your book is the degree to which, in a way that was not entirely precedented, these editors became celebrities in their own right. I mean, people not only knew the name Tina Brown, they knew what Tina Brown looked like. They knew what Anna Wintour looked like. And that kind of filtered down. There's sort of ripple effects in the industry to all this kind of stuff. So one person who kind of preceded all that, but kind of fit into the category, is Helen Gurley Brown, who for decades was the editor of Cosmo. And in the late 90s, she got forced out too. And right at that time, they called me up and they'd read something else that I'd written. They wanted me to write for Cosmo. Sometime if we're having coffee, it's a much longer, funnier story. But so I went to work for them, and then I started writing also for Mademoiselle. And then it turned out that you have to sign a contributing editor's contract with one of the two. You couldn't write for both of them at the same time. And I weighed this all, and I thought a little bit about it. And I ultimately decided to go to Mademoiselle. And I called up Catherine Romano, who was my editor at Vogue, at Cosmo, and I explained all that. And then I hung up the phone. I had this little office I rented in downtown Hartford all by myself. And About 10 minutes later, my phone rang, and it was Bonnie Fuller, the new editor, the new Helen Gurley Brown. And she screamed at me, like really, she screamed so loud for like sort of more than 5 minutes and never allowing me to speak at all. So I just actually held the phone at arm's length and I could still hear everything she was yelling. And since there was no need for me to talk, I could just kind of do that and enjoy the experience. And I realized later that I didn't matter to Bonnie Fuller. That was not a big deal. This was for the benefit of everybody else. She had one of those glass cubicle offices that, you had sort of all four sides were viewable by the newsroom. This was for the benefit of it. She was doing a performance because at this point, the celebrity editor thing, Michael, I think had become a thing that had to be performed to a certain degree just because it had reached a whole new level.
Yeah, I mean, so because these editors became celebrities, the magazines wanted them to really represent and symbolize the magazine for the public. So this is why Condé Nast editors had these insane expense accounts where they could drive all around town in a limousine and take first-class flights because their lifestyle had to epitomize kind of this luxurious world that the magazines represented. I like the idea of Bonnie Fuller screaming at you on the phone, this Devil Wears Prada moment and I'm sure she was to lose someone to a competitor like Mademoiselle. I mean, the competition, you cannot overstate how fiercely these magazines were competing for writers, for ads, for press. Even within Condé Nast, the Vanity Fair salespeople used to badmouth Vogue to their clients because they wanted to get the ads for themselves. So it was just a hugely competitive industry. And I love the idea of magazines aimed at, women in their teens and 20s fighting for the talents of Colin. That's a great.
I mean, it was hilarious. I was this drab little. I mean, I went to the first anniversary party of Mirabella in my outfit from Marshall's, was introduced to Bill Blass. I'm sure Bill Blass was wondering, was I there to park his car or something? But yeah, no, I was very, very inappropriate. But the other thing these magazines did was they found these kind of niches. So at Mademoiselle, I basically wrote the same article over and over again. It was about how to get him to commit. And there was always like a new overlay, like how to get him to commit if his mother doesn't like you, But it was, it was ferociously competitive. We should take a break and I should stop babbling. And I'll let Michael talk a lot more in the next segment. But we're talking about this book, this wonderful book, Empire of the Elite, Inside Condé Nast, the media dynasty that reshaped America, by Michael M. Grynbaum, and we will be back.
One, two, three. Read from the magazine, what did you see? Do you make the same faces in bed? Hey man, what kind of question is that? What did you really want me to say back? What's going on behind those dark glasses?
We're talking about the world of magazines with our guest today. We're very excited to have with us Michael Grynbaum. He's got a new book out called Empire of the Elite that chronicles, in particular, the kind of excitement and excesses of late 80s, 90s magazine culture driven by Cy Newhouse and Condé Nast. And, Michael, I think it's worth noting that there's almost a kind of doomed Feast of Trimalchio quality to a lot of this, particularly, from maybe 95 forward. There was, if anybody was paying attention, there was kind of the handwriting on the wall that somehow or other the print model wasn't going to be fully sustainable, not in the same way. And you get these kind of strange decisions being made, including Tina Brown's kind of bizarre decision to launch Talk, a magazine that was going to be, primarily a print model. And yet, there must have been a lot of smart people around who understood they were going to be in a whole heck of a lot of trouble if they didn't change.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be careful not to single out Condé Nast necessarily because, obviously the entire print media industry was still caught, off guard by how the internet devoured them and kind of, destroyed the business model. And this was true across newspapers and all different types of publications. By the mid 1990s and late 90s, we had AOL dial-up and CompuServe, and it was clear that, this revolution was happening. And what Condé failed to do was, look, they had world-famous brands like GQ, Vogue, and Vanity Fair. Instead of buying vanityfair.com and starting to grow that out, they said, we don't want to cannibalize the print titles, which in their defense were still making a ton of money from average luxury advertising. So they created things like Epicurious, which was a food and recipe site, which, by the way, food and recipe sites are now some of the most lucrative on the internet, but they called it that instead of gourmet.com. So then Gourmet Magazine kind of didn't have a presence on the internet, and, eventually it was killed off. So, there were some smart people inside the company who had ideas for e-commerce or, putting fashion shows online, photographs and things like that. But they really were starved for resources. I think that there was some hubris involved. I think that Condé Nast, which was known as kind of having the most tactile and sensual print products in the magazine trade, just basically thought that why would a reader ever want to consume, beautiful photographs and beautiful images through a screen? They thought that people would still want to, sit down and enjoy on the weekend a beautiful glossy magazine. And I think it took a very, very long time for them to understand that era was coming to a close.
Yeah, but I do want to sort of talk about the New Yorker, which I think, and you say this in the book too, to the extent that anybody kind of figured out a formula. The New Yorker is one of the places I think David Remnick gets a lot of the credit. But I have to say, Michael, one of the jaw on chest stories. This is a story I did not know, that when Tina Brown was leaving, the first plan was to make an offer to Michael Kinsley. Michael Kinsley is a spectacular journalist and somebody who really, he started Slate, and everybody quotes him to this day. I mean, he famously said a gaffe is when a politician accidentally tells the truth. He's like a big figure, but explain what happened to poor Michael Kinsley.
Well, you're right. Michael Kinsley, one of the great magazine journalists of his generation, when Tina Brown abruptly left the New Yorker, basically gave a few days' notice to Cy Newhouse, Cy called up Michael Kinsley, who had recently started a brand new online publication called Slate, and invited him to fly from Seattle to essentially interview for the New Yorker job. And they had these meetings over a weekend in New York City, and Cy Newhouse offered him the job. And Michael Kinsley, who, lived on the West Coast, he said, look, I need a day to think about it. I'd want to talk to my wife. I'd have to move myself over to the East Coast. It's a big decision. And Cy said, sure. And about 12 hours later, Kinsley got back to his hotel room at the Helmsley Hotel on Park Avenue, and his phone rang, and it was Cy Newhouse. And he said, you seem a bit hesitant. I think we should forget it. And so basically the job just vanished. And I think what Kinsley failed to grasp was that, Cy, who was an enthusiast of magazines, he wanted an editor who was not going to hesitate, who was going to, immediately reach for the brass ring when it was offered. And, Kinsley was pretty taken aback, and it was a fateful move. It ended up David Remnick, this very prolific, talented former newspaper journalist, became the editor. He's had a fantastic run and remains the editor of the New Yorker. But I think, for Kinsley, it was always this might have been moment. And it was also, I'll just say lastly, it was a real indicator of the mercurial nature of Cy Newhouse and how very quickly careers could be made and lost in the hallways of Condé Nast.
Yeah, and so, he gets offered a $5 million signing bonus and $1 million a year. This is Kinsley. It just must have been, and I think for also the way I interpreted the story too, is Newhouse is sort of saying, I'm calling up from the Yankees, I'm offering you a chance to play center field. And all I want to think about it is just not the answer. It's not the right answer to that kind of offer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right way to put it. Right. I mean, I'm offering you the world. And if you're going to hesitate, that makes me think, well, maybe as an editor, you're going to hesitate, right? I want someone with a killer instinct. I think that was the other element, too.
Yeah, I think also we should say that, and I still get the physical copy of The New Yorker. I enjoy having it. I don't always get, I have it more than I read it probably, but The New Yorker kind of had this reputation of being a little more coy and smart than some of its audience. I think Tina Brown did a lot to fix that, but I just have to play because I think you'll enjoy it. A famous clip from Seinfeld. This will be A1.
Well, I love this one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a rather clever jab at interoffice politics, don't you think?
Yeah. But why is it that the animals enjoy reading the email?
Well, Miss Bennis, cartoons are like gossamer, and one doesn't dissect gossamer.
Well, you don't have to dissect it. If you could just tell me why this is supposed to be funny.
Oh, it's merely a commentary on contemporary mores.
But what is the comment?
It's a slice of life.
No, it isn't.
A pun?
I don't think so.
Wohlstand?
That's not a word. You have no idea what this means, do you?
No.
Then why did you print it?
I like the kitty.
So that's Elaine Bennis talking to the cartoon editor of The New Yorker. And The New Yorker had a little bit of that reputation, right? It was like maybe a little bit smarter than you, And I do think that Brown and Remnick have done a lot to just sort of bring that product to the people. I don't know, if we're talking about 21st century magazine editors, I don't know how there could be anybody better than David Remnick. And in a way, Michael, he's managed to create a different kind of celebrity editor. He's not really going to go on the Today Show and participate in a cooking segment or something, but people know who he is, and he's through the podcast and everything else, he's the face and very much the voice of this publication in a way that just, as far as I can tell, does nothing but help it.
Well, first, that's such a great Seinfeld episode. That script was written by Bruce Eric Kaplan, who your readers might know as BEK, the longtime New Yorker cartoonist who was kind of commenting on his own profession. And I think Remnick has been a fabulous editor. By the way, let's talk about the fact that Tina Brown, for all the kind of pyrotechnics of the contents of the magazine, lost a lot of money. I mean, The New Yorker was losing tens of millions of dollars a year to produce the magazine. And Remnick took that over and within a few years had brought it back into some kind of financial stability, and then actually made it profitable. And he pioneered the New Yorker Festival, which, now every publication has these live conferences as a revenue stream. They also introduced a paywall, which at the time was quite controversial, and there was a real question about readers would be able to pay for the magazine, and so there was that was a big moment where the New Yorker nowadays is one of the magazines of Condé Nast that actually makes money, which is compared to where it was 20 years ago, a big change.
Yeah, and think about the beginning of the movie Tar. It's the New Yorker Festival. Adam Gopnik is on stage interviewing the Cate Blanchett character. I didn't give you a chance to tell your Bloomberg story. You got to tell the Bloomberg story. This is about when you're working on the book and you run into Bloomberg, I think in London. Just tell that story really quickly.
So I had covered, I was a City Hall reporter at the New York Times, and I covered Mike Bloomberg. And when I was writing this book, I ran into him at a party and sort of said hello. There was like a glimmer of recognition, sort of remembered who I was. And, I was telling him about a book about Condé Nast, and he asked, well, who are the characters? Who are you going to be focusing on? And I said, well, Graydon Carter and Anna Wintour and Tina Brown. And he looked at me and said, Tina Brown, I spoke at her memorial service. And there was a silence in the room. And then I kind of looked at him and I said, well, I think that Tina is still alive. And he said, I meant Helen Gurley Brown.
So yeah, there's no such thing as immortality in this business. Well, the book is terrific. I don't have time, and I think anyway people should buy the book and read it for so many of the stories. The one that made me just really, really laugh, and I'll just tease it in order to goose sales along, is the Vanity Fair party, Monica Lewinsky, Shoshana Lonstein, Fran Lebowitz story, which, I mean, I really had to put down the book and just laugh for a while about it. It was such a hilarious story. But Michael, you've written a profoundly readable book, but also I think a pretty important book about, how, maybe it's just, we wrap up here, maybe say a few words about, I mean, I think in the 90s, those crown jewels, Vanity Fair, Vogue, The New Yorker, they kind of defined taste and what was good and what was worthy of approval in America, maybe what you should want to have, what your aspirations should be. Do you think that they still can do that, or does this happen through Instagram influencers and stuff like that?
Well, I want to say that I grew up in West Hartford, and so these magazines were in many ways like portals to me to what was going on in New York and L.A. and London, and I think that even when it's transmitted digitally, these sort of magazine brands still function as a way to, educate and edify readers about what's happening in the culture. I think that it's a lot easier to access that now via Instagram and places like that. But I would say that, in a lot of ways, what Instagram does is kind of a recreation of Condé Nast. You have the lavish house tours, you have the exotic travelogues, celebrities posing in these, lavish photo shoots. In a funny way, the means of production have been passed on to the masses, and the masses have recreated what Condé Nast was doing all those years. So I think that the business model for print magazines is broken, and I think that there's a new editor of Vanity Fair, for instance, who I think is trying to figure out, well, what does Vanity Fair look like in the kind of digital 21st century era? But what they represent and kind of their role as arbiters in a way, it endures in a lot of sense. And I think that it'll be very interesting to see how Condé Nast tries to kind of push these titles into the new era.
All right, this is a perfect place for us to end. We're going to spend the third segment talking about the magazine I absolutely do read pretty much cover to cover every week. Michael M. Grynbaum is media correspondent for the New York Times, author of the new book, Empire of the Elite, Inside Condé Nast, the media dynasty that reshaped America. So much fun, so interesting, great book, Michael, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll take a break. We'll come back.
One boy calls while the other texts. He's got boys on board and boys on deck. Second, third, fifth tissues. New York is pretty heavy. Girl, I hope it doesn't crush you. Second, third, fifth tissues. New York is pretty heavy. Girl, I hope it doesn't crush you.
And we are back. Some thanks. Dylan Reyes is our technical producer most of the time. I think he's been pulling some of the music and stuff like that for today's show. But with his hands on the controls right now, it's the Jedi Master. That's Gene Amatruda. He's our producer right now. And the producer of this episode is kind of the new Tina Brown. Lily Tyson Quality Entertainment Productions, kind of the new Condé Nast, too. And she's a superstar and very ruthless, but obviously one of the driving forces in shaping opinions in America today. So great to be working with her today as well, unless I get fired. I often get fired and rehired the same day. It's that kind of mercurial life here. So, yes, once a week, I go down to my mailbox and I'm very happy to find a copy of The Week. The Week is this terrific magazine, which I feel like you have to read physically. You have to hold it in your hands. I have no interest in reading it online. And we're going to talk about it right now with its managing editor, Mark Gemain, a managing editor for the print edition of The Week. Mark, welcome to our show.
Hi, Colin. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for telling me about Lily's ruthless reputation.
Oh, yeah. No, you probably got a taste of that in your conversations with her. But
let me ask you a question straight, not to reverse things, but when you read the magazine, I heard the end of the last segment, and you said you read it cover to cover. Do you read it in kind of one sitting? or a couple
No,
cities?
it's certainly
Dip
kind
into
of a box of chocolates that you can sort of consume. You can either binge it or you can have a little at a time. It works either way, because we should say the week is, I mean, it's sort of insulting to call it a digest of everything that's happened. I mean, it kind of is that, but a very stylistically satisfying, far-ranging, and very sort of hip and curious.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to
distillation.
put it, and I'm not offended by the digest word.
But so, and you guys go everywhere too. So there are segments about food, there are segments about culture and what's being dropped on streaming television, but also the stuff in the news. Maybe I want to begin with the cover, because the cover, I think it's important about the cover. One of the things that is kind of dying out is the editorial cartoon, which used to be such a kind of driving force in opinion shaping, but I think as print media struggles a little bit, the editorial cartoon. So as far as I know, every single cover of the week is a very, full color, glossy, and usually pretty good editorial cartoon.
Just about. Very, very occasionally, there have been times when we have resorted to photos. There was some Ukraine stuff. Sort of sometimes in kind of for very tragic events, we turned to photos. But yeah, and it's a fine line. A lot of them are funny, but not every one of them is funny too. And about the editorial cartoons dying out. It's true. We're happy to be keeping it alive because, in fact, in the magazine, we also do a little roundup of cartoons. And I'm going to tell you the truth. We go through so many of them. We go through, to choose the six, we go through 150, 160. And, I'm not going to call out names there are so many unfunny ones. I mean, you got to get six really pointed ones. Really funny ones. You got to go through a lot.
Yeah, and there sort of was a time when editorial cartoonists were kind of celebrities. You kind of knew who Herb Block was, or McNeely, or somebody like that.
Yeah.
You knew the names of these people. I just don't think that's really the case anymore. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about how you do put this together, how your staff does put this together? I mean, it's everything is very, very, readably sized. You can get through everything really fast, and you do an excellent job of also sampling opinions across a political or philosophical or ideological perspective, making sure that lots of different bases get covered. Say a little bit more about what the philosophy is behind the product you're delivering.
The philosophy is that okay, so as in a newspaper story or a newspaper story, kind of a reporter will go and talk to a bunch of people, and there will be the sources, and they will kind of build the story out of that, out of their thoughts, out of their opinions, out of kind of the information they can provide. You can kind of think of other outlets as our sources. It is almost like interviewing them, and we kind of say, hey, and we kind of put them in a discussion with each other, and the process is a lot like the process at any other news organization, with a couple of caveats. So, on Friday, we start discussing kind of what's going to be in the issue that we wrap up on Wednesday. There's also kind of stuff, the food, the culture stuff is finished a little bit earlier. So on Friday, we're kind of starting to discuss what's going to happen in this issue for the news and in the next issue for culture. And there is kind of a spirited debate that what we want to do is we want to take the arguments on kind of the big issues of the day and the big news of the day, and we want to let each side kind of make its best case. We want to find the best sort of formulation of each viewpoint, and this is especially true with the political story. So we want people to feel like they've gotten not just a range of arguments, but the strongest version of those arguments. In some ways, it's become a harder job over the last. I've been there for 7 years, so in that time, when I started, or even it was a little easier to say, hey, you're going to take one from column A, one from column B, two from the Democratic column, two from the Republican column. It has become very polarized. It's kind of hard to create a narrative. So and frankly, not all of the arguments are equal. So we find situations where we'll do a story about ice, and we're not really going to have a lot of people out there saying, hey, it's great that we'll have people discussing about, hey, people being seized, taken off the streets, people wearing masks, and you're not going to find, and you'll find a range of views, but you're not going to find sort of people saying, hey, it's a great idea, all these people should be wearing masks, and running roughshod.
Yeah, and one thing I like too is the magazine does have its own voice. You don't get to see it too much, but on the sort of the table of contents page, there's typically from one of you editors. It's like probably about 500 words or something, but it's sort of
360.
Okay, 360 words.
We know those numbers.
Here's how it is, but here's how we see this stuff. I just want to quickly, before we run out of time, and say one of the things that we subscribe to on this show, and I like in my own life, is whimsy. And I think you guys do that really well too. There's these little segments. One of them, I think, was called "It Wasn't All Bad,"
yes.
and another one was another one I think is called "Only in America." There's also "It Was a Great Week For," or "It Was a Bad Week For," and you do some funny setups to things like that. Maybe talk a little bit. This is a magazine that has a genuine sense of humor that works anyway for me as a reader. Talk a little bit about that.
People want People want a combination of the news and a break from the news. Not All Bad is, which happens to be a section that I edit. It's super important. The stories, the story of the surfing dogs, the Chincoteague ponies crossing. People want to know that life is not only kind of a question of conflict, and that we also, at the end of the magazine, we run an excerpt from another publication. And a lot of the times, what we're looking for there, not always, but is something that is offbeat. When I think of the stories that are my very favorite, if I had to name kind of a very favorite one that I've chosen for that last word excerpt, it was a story from an online magazine called Topic about elevator phobes who work in New York high rises, and one of them actually had an elevator lawyer. The law was that you could use the stair. The law was you had to let them use. So if somebody said, "Hey, this is on the 50th floor, I can't use the stairs," so they called up. So that level of kind of appealing to people's need for whimsy, for a change, but also you always kind of want to tell people something they don't know. Yeah. That is the core of any news organization, whether it's ours or not. If you remember that, that's key. If you forget it, it sucks.
Yeah, we're kind of out of time here. I just want to say, for me and my job, and once a week I do a show, it's typically on Mondays, where I don't book any guests and I just take calls, and people can bring up anything. It's called Ask or Tell Me Anything. I consider the week essential because it's kind of like a multivitamin. You might have forgotten to eat your broccoli. You might have forgotten to read about this particular thing this week. But I mean, if you read the week cover to cover, it's unlikely you're going to draw a lot of blanks because it is a great multivitamin. So take that for what it's worth. But Mark Gamane, thank you so much, managing editor at the print edition of The Week, of which I am apparently the biggest fanboy ever. So we're going to say goodbye. Thanks for coming, Mark. We're going to say goodbye to you and goodbye for the week, as they say, and let's hear about the week.
52 times a year, the week is done and over with before you know. The world and the weather help fashion a week. The lunatic thoughts politicians will speak. The hindsight that always illumines the press. The sex life of film stars, a general mess. The one week the cabinet gets rearranged. The next week April Ashley says nothing has changed. That was the week that was. It's over, let it be. Just let the world swing by. If that's all right with you, then it's all right with me. That was the week that was. It's over, let it go. Ooh, what a week that was. That was the week.